This time on Ask Christian Counseling Associates, we meet with professor and licensed professional counselor Dr. Kristen Kinsevich to discuss the state of clergy mental health as we ask the question, how is my pastor doing? Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here, and I want to welcome Dr. Kristen Kinsevich. Kristen is a licensed professional counselor, and she has 20 years of experience in ministry, and she is a professor at Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri. Kristen, anything else you'd like to tell the audience about yourself before we dive into this topic about clergy in crisis?
Yeah, I spent those 20 years of ministry kind of really passionate about embedding clinical mental health care into church settings. So I've kind of done that in a variety of ways. I care a lot about mental health in the church. So that's been a passion really since I was 16 years old. I won't get into the whole calling story unless you ask me about it, but it's been a lifelong passion of mine to see the church kind of break down the stigma of mental illness, and, that the church would provide the best kind of care, which for me, I feel is, clinically informed. And so that's how I've spent my time. My husband has been associate and executive pastor kinds of roles. We've been in urban ministry, so that's a big passion of mine as well. And we have two children who are 14 and 16 years old. And so that's an adventure, just parenting high school students. So that's a little bit about me. Yeah.
Well, and you're also heavy duty in the clinical work. You're licensed as a professional counselor, and you are an instructor of counseling at Evangel University. So you're just all around into this topic.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. I love supervising and training students. I've been supervising clinical students since about 2012 or so. And yeah, training them on kind of how does this work if you are providing clinical counseling in a church setting. There's a lot of things to think about. I blogged about that for a while before getting my PhD, so have a lot to say on that topic as well.
That's great, and you have authored a book specifically for the church, but anybody should pick this up. It's called On Edge: Mental Illness in the Christian Context. That's available on Amazon.com. For anybody, after listening to this today, we would encourage you, if you want to know more, check that out. And so really what we're talking about today, you've done a lot of work on, and that's very exciting. And you talk about the stigma of mental health in the church. And just to put this out here, we really here notice that in the mental health community, we try to engage the church, and the mental health community's sort of pointed in another direction. I would describe that as, at Christian Counseling Associates, we really value our connection to the body of Christ, or the Christian community. And so when somebody comes here in crisis, of whatever that might be, they're struggling from a depression and anxiety, trauma, marital problems, and there's a whole range of things we could call out here. We have a time of individual counseling. That's the model, and it's private. It's designed to be easy, where all these things could be sorted out, and we can get a deeper look, and we can get control over what was disordered, and we can move towards an order of things where our life stabilizes. But then we see a continuum of care where we should have a check-in with the family. Of course, this is private, so it needs to be approved, and that is voluntary. But it's really effective, because one of the scandals in counseling is the client who comes to counseling and says, I've changed, this is great, I feel great, and everybody around them, especially the people close to them, are saying nothing has changed. Or the reality of the person who's saying, I just feel like I'm spinning my wheels continually, I'm not getting anywhere, and everybody else around them is saying, wow, we really see a season of growth in your life. And so the family check-in is a place where, if permitted, we can get some pointed feedback, some valuable feedback from the client. And then Sometimes there's some work there of reconciliation. Maybe there's marital problems or something, and we can engage that. And then we move to the group therapy. Very unpopular. It has to be guided by counseling, and that's something that we offer here. That for a time, then we put it in the context of what does my problem mean to everybody else, and what does everybody else mean to me. And usually the client's first reaction is, this is about me. Why should I connect with anybody else on this? But what we're preparing them for is life in the church, a reconnection and a reconciliation there, a life group. And understanding that when I can do that, I have the best chance of confronting my personal problems. And so that's our model. But the mainstream of mental health, and sometimes even because it's so iconic, I think the Christian counseling movement just wants to keep people in individual counseling and forever. That this is something that should be cradle to grave. And that, unfortunately, in many of those instances, it becomes a replacement for the reconnection and the reconciliation to the body of Christ, the church. We see when people go through this continuum of care that it is transformative, it's profound, and in my opinion, my experience, nothing outdoes it. Although we would like to find replacements for it. So I'd put that model out there, because I know that you think of these things in your professorship. And, but the stigma of mental health, getting back to that in the Christian community, that's a big problem for that last stage. When people are told or they get the idea that I shouldn't have any kind of transparency with the church. I should keep it to myself. There's a Christian context to mental health problems, mental illness, and you've done a lot of work around that. So why don't we start there? Tell us about your work and the things that you've experienced that is important for our listeners to reflect on.
Sure. Well, like I said, all the way back as young as 15, 16 years old, I felt called into ministry. So by 16, I felt called specifically to be a counselor in a church. And I really didn't know what that meant, except for I had grown up in church. There was a pastor who did counseling at the church. And so that was something kind of I had seen, but his training was not clinical. And so, I kind of was familiar with biblical counseling. I won't get too into that unless you ask me about it, but I felt
You mean like Nathetic counseling or Jay Adams?
Go ahead.
Okay. Like when you say biblical counseling, are you referring to Nathetic counseling or biblical counseling?
Yes,
like
Nathetic counseling, Jay Adams. Yeah. So for me, in my observation of that, and I can't speak to every case that's ever, that Nathetic counseling has ever touched, but it certainly wasn't clinically informed, wasn't biologically informed. Adams had these very narrow categories of kind of organic disorders, which is kind of like brain injury and a thyroid problem. And essentially, his definition was so narrow because it is so difficult to measure mental illness. That's one of the reasons for stigma, is that they're working on these kinds of things, but right now we can't really just take a blood test and get diagnosed with depression,
or possibly ever. Correct?
Yeah. So I would still say there's a lot of organic disorders that are, various classifications of, what we would find in the DSM-5, but ultimately, Adams didn't see it that way. And so, his book, Competent to Counsel, really kind of painted a picture of pastors, if you know the Bible, then you're competent to provide counseling. And so that was the model that I saw, but the gaps that I saw were in situations that I was, again, I wasn't aware of every situation, but there were a handful that I saw that, it seemed to me there was more going on. And of course, I didn't know anything about psychology at the time. I just kind of knew that it existed. I think in my senior year of high school, I took my first psychology class and was like, hey, maybe there's something going on. But if you're not trained in clinical diagnosis, then you're doing assessment without knowing you're doing it, right? So you are determining that maybe a person, this is their problem. Maybe it's, sin, and they need to repent, or they need to be discipled, live differently, which I'm not dismissing. Obviously, we need to all grow spiritually and emotionally, but psychology gives us additional tools to do that. And so for me, that was kind of the passion around bringing clinical mental health services into
well, let me jump in. You're making some great points, because there is this kind of one-dimensional view on the spiritual side, that we're gonna pray about this, and this is what's going on, and you've seen some pretty extreme demonstrations of that in the church, and so that's one side of the spectrum, and the other side, there's this debate about this nature nurture debate that goes on, and it's not only in the church, but it's all over psychology too. So what is the biological basis of behavior, and you do have people out there, pastors, who say, like, look, if you're having a real problem, you should go see a psychiatrist, and then come and talk to us. And they don't feel equipped. And then you have other people who say, like, there is a blood test you could get, or it's coming next year. And the only thing that I would say, knowing the history of psychology, if we're to be honest, we've been saying that the whole time. And I don't know if you would agree. The brain is so complicated. Because that would be that's a standard part that we teach in psychology. And before psychology, I was a biology major, which the information was even exponentially more complex. So I remember walking into the class of psychology and just looking at what was being taught there and saying, man, I don't even know if this is right. It's been made so it's simplified. That we may never know the connections biologically. And so the best thing that we have today, and I've been out of the textbooks for a couple of years, but that everything is a biopsychosocial process. And what the Christian community will insist upon is it's a biopsychosocial spiritual process. And these debates about what comes first or what is prominent, you're going to see those debates all over the place. So it's very confusing for the church about how much should I know about this.
There's such a long history of this conversation, and I really think that there's value to the conversation. I mean, Jay Adams didn't just come out of nowhere. Really, Freud, Skinner, and Carl Rogers and others picked a fight with religion from the get-go. If you read their original works, I mean, they were not neutral to religion. Albert Ellis was, part of his rational emotive behavior therapy was confronting the irrational thoughts, and religion was kind of put in that category of irrational thoughts that needed to be gotten rid of. And so there was a need for the church to respond. You had people like Clyde Naramore, who he was kind of an early Christian psychologist who was speaking about kind of this idea of integrating those two things. And out of that tension, you got, in, I think, the late 60s, Fuller Theological Seminary was one of the first to establish a psychology program, in terms of the evangelical community. And so then you've got, someone like Jay Adams, who was teaching at a theological seminary, I think with a Presbyterian background. He was, kind of saying, hey, like, Psychology is making an intentional effort to replace God. They're coming up with all these wild theories about human behavior. And honestly, I think if we read Freud today, we'd say, yeah, they were wild theories. That wasn't exactly the most stringent
Yeah.
scientific method. So
Yeah.
part of what,
Absolutely.
part of what I
Yeah.
talk to my students about is kind of how we have to take these conversations in the context of the history where they happened, but we can't have the same conversations today that we were having 50 or 100 years ago. So we kind of have to evolve with the conversation, and that's what I've tried to do in speaking about this. Not to say, okay, we have to pick one way of thinking and that's the right way. It's a very modernist approach. Now we're in kind of a postmodern world where we get to say, let's look at the complexity of people, the complexity of the church, the mental health crisis that exists, and what are all the tools available to us, and how do we steward those in the best way possible. And so, for me, the integration process has really been an important part of that. We don't just swallow psychology whole, but we, sit with it from a Christian worldview, biblical worldview, and say, how do we understand, the mental health crisis, mental health disorders through that lens? But also, if I'm needing heart surgery, I want to go to a doctor who's studied heart surgery, not just a Christian who's studied the Bible really well and, is going to change my heart. Right. Those are two different kinds of meaning of the word heart. And we need to know about both of them if we're going to do this well.
Yeah. So taking an integrative approach, let's talk about the view of mental illness and how that, what we need to understand from a Christian context, what that is.
I mean, you mentioned the biopsychosocial spiritual model. That's what I teach my students. It is important to think about the whole person. And, to recognize that while it is true that everyone needs Jesus and everyone needs eternal salvation, that's not the cure for mental illness. Like I said, most of my clinical work was working with people who already knew Jesus, who were Christians, who also were experiencing depression, anxiety.
So what do you say about that? Because that's one of the big questions in the Christian community. I'm a Christian, and here I am depressed, or I'm mentally ill. I'm psychotic. I'm hearing voices. Or I'm so anxious I can't leave my house. I thought that if I was being a mature Christian, that would not happen. And I am a mature Christian. I'm a good, maybe even some people would say I'm a good person. What do we say to that?
Yeah, I mean, the book that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that I wrote, On Edge, Mental Illness in the Christian Context, all of the chapter titles are questions that I've really been asked throughout my career. One of them is, can I be a good Christian and still be depressed? Something along those lines. Should Christians take psychiatric medication? So there's all these questions. And ultimately, I've worked with all of these clients who were struggling with those questions because they felt like they were second-class Christians, or they must be doing something wrong or not praying enough. And there are these sometimes covert as well as overt messages in the church, from songs to sermons or books that kind of communicate, that basically, it's wrong or it's sinful, to experience anxiety, that kind of cast your cares on God. He cares for you. Don't be anxious about anything. We have these verses. And if we take them as commands instead of kind of reassurance, or we look at them from a clinical lens instead of a spiritual lens, then we can kind of get muddled in that.
Right. Well, it is. I mean, that plays out. Like, I have anxiety, and so what do we need, when we're looking in that through the face or through the lens of faith? What do we need to realize there? And I'd imagine I didn't get a chance, honestly, to the audience. I'm gonna get On Edge, Mental Illness in the Christian Context, but I didn't get a chance to read this today. What's your conclusion to that? Because I think that as clinicians, there's certain viewpoints on that,
Yeah, I mean, my perspective, and I talk about this in the book in the chapter about medication in particular, that any step we take towards being well is a step towards the kingdom of God, because we know that God's intention, God's will for us is to be healed, to be well. We will be healed fully in heaven. And so we know that there is, an enemy out there that is, in all kinds of ways, whether it's cancer or mental illness or, heart disease or any other kind of illness, that there are all these ways that our world is deteriorating, our bodies deteriorate. And that's part of the fall. That's part of the curse. That doesn't mean that your individual sin is causing that. If I mean, it gets tricky. Let's think about something like a heart attack and someone who ate, 5 cheeseburgers for lunch every day and then they have a heart attack. Is that, their personal sin caused that heart attack? Well, no, because there's probably somebody else who ate 5 cheeseburgers for lunch every day that didn't have a heart attack, right? So, but overall, as we look broadly, should we do things to take care of ourselves? Yes. Does that help us prevent disease? Sure. But that doesn't mean that I need to pray more to be healed from depression.
Right. What do we say? I mean, in that kind of context, like take medication or not, that a lot of the clinical community and a lot of the Christian community certainly says, don't do it unless you absolutely have to. Medications are overprescribed. Long-term medication use is damaging. We see the commercials that say, you have, tremors now that you're taking additional medication for. This is industry driven. It's not results driven. And that's part of the postmodern view too coming in. We were promised that this would be the cure, and it's not. What are we? What position do we take with people coming out like that?
Yeah. I think sometimes there can be some black and white thinking, if there's problems with the pharmaceutical industry, therefore we should be very suspicious of everything and never take any medication. I think there's balance and kind of gray area here. Yes, medications are overprescribed. No, Prozac is not going to cure depression. It's a part of the equation for some people. And so for my clients, I've always talked about, if you haven't really sat in counseling for a solid 3 months or so, if you haven't really attempted to try to kind of improve diet or exercise or coping skills, then yeah, definitely that should be the first effort. It takes work. We don't all have mental illness, but we all do need to maintain our mental health, and we have to work at that. That doesn't just automatically happen. Just like I don't wake up one day with big muscles. I have to go work out if I want those big muscles, right? So emotionally, we have to take care of ourselves. And sometimes, and I've had many clients in this scenario, they make those efforts or they try and it just seems like there's this hump they cannot get over, particularly, let's say, in the case of depression. And I have seen just even a small dose of an antidepressant literally turn someone's life around in conjunction with these efforts that they're making. But I've seen people go from, I'm trying to get to the gym or I'm trying to go for a walk. I just can't make myself do it. I can't make myself get out of bed, to then that medication kind of gives them a little bit of a boost. It helps them be able to then use those coping skills or make some better choices. And so I've seen that really work. It also doesn't mean that you have to be on that forever. I've seen plenty of people who are on maybe an antidepressant for about a year, work on these things, kind of improve their resilience, maybe overcome some of the kind of challenges that maybe led to the depression in the first place, and then come off of that medication. Something like ADHD, it's complicated because most of the medications for ADHD are stimulants, which are addictive. There's a real risk with that. Strattera is one that's the only non-stimulant for ADHD. And that is something, again, I've seen people, their lives absolutely transformed by a really crippling problem that they could not willpower their way out of. It's just literally their brain is not working the same way as other people's, and medication changes their life. Does that mean every boy who's 6 years old and wants to run around his classroom should, get put on a medication? Of course not. So those are, just some factors to weigh out.
Yeah, we've just personally, clinical experience and the opinion on this is, it seems like the mainstream wants to medicate And I think statistically, it's a fact that medications are overprescribed. Yeah, so our official position here at Christian Counseling Associates is we would like to see you on the least medication for the least amount of time possible to be healthy. And a lot of times, because of that fact that it's overprescribed, that least amount of time is zero. And there's a lot of research. Man, I can't remember the author of Anatomy of an Epidemic. What's his name?
I'm not sure, but I've read another book too like that, and I don't remember the title either. But yeah, there's plenty.
Camden's going to look it up. A lot of things. There's been a host of books that have been widely endorsed that are collecting data sets, studies that say, a lot of times you do feel better in the outset of those medication trials, but then it turns into an up and down kind. And really treating, over the years, scores of people, we've seen a lot of people with a bunch of mixed results. And that's, again, it's a very postmodern kind of view that I take on this. But what's his name?
Robert Whitaker.
Robert Whitaker. Interesting research that compares. It takes all these comparisons, and so the outcome is that we're no better off after the advent of Prozac and everything that comes after than we were before. And then if you travel internationally, especially the third world countries, so we do clinical work in Liberia, where there's no medication. And this is not a scientific study, folks, but I would say that the people there emotionally are healthier than we are.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot about our American culture and the priorities that it has. And honestly, some of that gets swallowed up easily by the church too. There's a lot of church trends. I mean, I know we're going to talk about clergy and pastors. There's a lot of really unhealthy church trends and a lot of pressure we put on ourselves, a lot of ways in which, we're living kind of, we have our cell phones, we have to respond every time it beeps, there's a lot of things that are negatively impacting our mental health. So as the medications have improved, our reasons for needing it, have gotten worse in a sense, not to mention the pandemic and the challenges that came with that, especially among young people and the ways their lives got disrupted. So there's just a lot of factors. And sometimes, the problem comes when people want a pill to solve it and they don't want to do the work. But sometimes the mental health problems stop us from being able to do the work. So there's this kind of tug, and each individual case has to be looked at carefully and with care and lots of support and help. I think what I'm passionate about is making sure that when Christians do need to take medication, that they don't feel like a second-class Christian, that, I should have had the willpower, the self-control, the discipline, but, or I should have had control over my emotions or my mind, but I didn't. And so it's a defeat to take medication, as opposed to, I am proactively taking steps towards my wellness. Like I said, for me, that is, I am moving closer to God's design for wellness in my life. I'm looking for not to be some kind of, some people think medication is going to turn them into a zombie, or, if you're like falling asleep on your medication, that's not a good medication. You shouldn't, that's not the solution if it's not helping you feel well. So I think it's a broad and holistic approach that's necessary, where counselors and pastors and doctors and, all kinds of, mentioned family support, like everyone needs to rally, to be there and help people, and not, there's a book called Why Do Christians Shoot Their Wounded? Not kind of victim blame when someone needs that help, or guilt them or shame them, but to just walk alongside and offer them support. I don't know if you are familiar with the book Mental Illness. Hold on. What's that called? I'm looking at, Troubled Minds by Amy Simpson. She talks about mental illness in the church there. And she calls mental illness the no casserole illness. If someone's hospitalized for psychiatric reasons, how many times do you set up a meal train in that scenario, right? Versus other kinds of so-and-so's in the hospital and what can we do
You
for
know,
them?
you know what I find is, in my personal experience within the church, either you have a way of dealing with that or you have no way of dealing with it. And there's a lot of people out there, because they have no way, they are blind to what's happening. So I could be sitting in a room and I'm just attending to how people are. I'm listening to what they're saying. I'm looking at how they appear, and I can tell when something's wrong. And then I could say to the person next to me, "Hey, did you catch that?" And they'll be like, "What?" And we could go around that over and over. And there's people in the church who are just very checked out, and it's a way of being. Non-clinical term, it's a form of carelessness. It's not being watchful. And so I think that counseling is a Christian word. Certainly Jesus is called the Wonderful Counselor. And that there's this high demand in the church that we should live a process together of transparency and accountability, and we need to be watchful in that. But there's a lot of people around, including myself, sometimes just not really doing that at all. And then eventually we get stuck, isolated. So there's so many different ways to guide somebody in dealing with these things. And we go from a spectrum of, I was depressed this day, or I was depressed at some part during the day, to I need to check myself into a facility because I'm a danger to myself or to somebody else. And that, and what we've just been conversating about is how do we see that from the lens of faith? And we have this topic, clergy in crisis. So what does it mean when the leader, or a leader in the church, who is preaching the word of God and has a shepherding function, without going into a theological discussion of what is a clergy person, how do we break that down? When our pastor is experiencing a mental health crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a range. You use the phrase mental health crisis, which, I mean, you're describing maybe a scenario that I don't know how many people are going to necessarily, be in a congregation and then suddenly their pastor has a mental health crisis. There have been some high profile suicides of pastors. So definitely we've seen that. It's more likely that your pastor is experiencing either burnout or mild depression, and you have no idea, and they might not even have any idea either. I've done a couple of studies nationally of pastors, one with Assemblies of God ministers and one with Baptist ministers. And we can talk about potential reasons for this, but in the Assemblies of God study that I did, which I collected data, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. About 40% of the pastors could be diagnosed. We gave them the PHQ-9, which you're probably familiar with, so you can diagnose from that. They had mild or higher depression levels. If we narrow that down to just moderate or higher, it was about 14.2, I think, percent of the pastors that were experiencing moderate or higher depression. For the Baptist pastors, which we collected data in the last year, mild or higher was 52%. Now you could say, is that a trend? Like, okay, just a few years went by and so now that is higher, or there's something fundamentally different about Assemblies of God versus Baptists? I'm not sure. There's really not data to suggest why our findings were a little bit higher for those Baptist pastors. But then ultimately it was, instead of 14%, it was 17% that were moderate or higher in the Baptist schools. My hunch is that it is kind of time dependent. I don't think there's something particularly different about those two denominations, although there certainly in the Southern Baptist Convention has been a lot of stress that's been quite public about some of the challenges of their denomination. So maybe there's something to be said for that. But I think just going through the pandemic,
I think that'd be super interesting to Kristen, to do a study on every denomination and see if there's actual significant differences that we could identify. I think that would be very difficult, but
say overall, and this is where I don't think the populations are fundamentally different. That was the only difference, was an increase in that rate. But in terms of any statistical significant differences among them, and even Duke University has done a lot with Methodist clergy, so there's information there. They're really, as a population, the data is the same. So there's not really a lot of fundamental difference in that. So that's why I think time is probably the best explanation of that.
And we all have some opinion on who are the most mentally ill. So, but I have it would be hard to. I mean, I'm joking. I wonder what you think of this. The National Christian Foundation, and I just Googled this to at the beginning of our talk here. The State of Pastors 2024. And I've heard a lot of descriptions like this. In 2024, most pastors have faced a multitude of issues they could never have anticipated, and it's weighing on them. Together, a radically shifting culture, an intense political climate, concerns about new technologies, and a multi-year global pandemic have produced a tsunami of challenges that they can't and shouldn't have to handle alone. And then they quote some Barna research. I like the Barna research. I think they do a great job, but they say they did a nationwide survey, and they asked pastors, are any of the following reasons why you have considered quitting full-time ministry? Select all that apply, and they got percentages of who select these. And I'll read a couple. First, I would quit full-time ministry because of the immense stress of the job. 56% endorsed that. I feel lonely and isolated, 43%. Yeah. Current political divisions, 38%. I am unhappy with the effect this rule has had on my family, 29%. I am not optimistic about the future of my church, 29%. And there's a list here that sort of continues to rank. So those seem pretty reasonable to me. Yeah. In the private moments, pastors would be contemplating, maybe ruminating over things like that. Yeah. And this foundation it appears to want to reach out to pastors. So you've done research on this over the years, and what kind of things specifically are important to your work? Tell us more about that.
I mean, one of the most significant findings that now I'm going to pursue this as a new kind of line of research is specifically related to that isolation piece regarding clergy friendship. So when I was setting up my dissertation survey, I was putting in different demographic questions, and literally just kind of on a whim, I threw in a question that asked how many close friends they had, and they could choose from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or more. And so what was interesting was that variable was significant for every well-being variable and whether or not pastors would seek help or professional counseling if they needed it. In the AG, for Baptists as well, that was a consistently significant variable. And so generally around 2 or 3 friends is kind of the break line. It just depends on which variable you're asking about. In terms of the impact. But I mean, you see these charts that are like, if you have 0 friends, here's how you're doing. And if you have 4 friends, here's how you're doing. There's just a straight line. And so the trends are it's crazy really to look at these graphs and see what a difference it makes on depression, on burnout scales, on spiritual well-being, occupational stress. So all of these different things. And we asked other than your spouse. So it's kind of a question of who could you talk to about things that are important to you other than your spouse? How many people do you have? That is a really interesting finding. And I think one that impacts pastors really significantly. And also, if you have fewer friends, you're less likely to reach out and go to professional counseling. So there's a lot of pastors that are suffering silently. And again, I don't think their congregations often have any idea that that's happening. Sometimes it ends up in a moral failure or maybe a suicide. And that's when we find out there was this problem all along.
So in your findings, one important thing is that pastors are frequently isolated. And the more isolated, the more pronounced their emotional problems tend to be. And that, what are the reasons for that? I would agree with you, just through observation, not having a study to quote. It's almost like it's expected that the pastor would be isolated or set apart. Why? Why do you think that happens?
Well, I think there's a long history of, kind of an evolution of the pastoral role. If you think back to maybe I don't know, the 1800s, and each town maybe had the minister, right? And he kind of preached on Sundays and visited people when they were sick and, did weddings and funerals. And that was kind of the role. And it was actually a very respected role in the community, and everyone kind of knew what it was. Fast forward to really the last kind of 30 years, especially, there's a declining church in America. There is less kind of understanding of what the pastoral role is. And then fast forward to the pandemic, now we all have to be really awesome with technology. We're all televangelists suddenly. Essentially, I've heard a lot of pastors describe it that way, that their role involuntarily changed. And they have to now have the right lighting and the right camera and the right skinny jeans to kind of be this person that's reaching everyone and maybe the whole world. So there's just a lot of ambiguity with what the pastor's role is. And then there's just a lot of congregational demands as well. And so that just creates an isolating situation. You can't, who can you talk to? Maybe your board of elders would be, high level leaders in the church, but they have the power. And often I've heard, plenty of stories of people who the board of elders doesn't like what you're doing. They vote you out, and so there is this stress, not to mention in denominations. If I reach out to my denominational leadership for help, then are they going to pull my credentials if I admit that I'm struggling with something, which historically has been kind of the knee-jerk reaction. And so there's a lot that the AG specifically is doing to try to counteract that and kind of care for its ministers, kind of be a little more clear about what is credential threatening and what isn't, to help ministers feel like they can come forward when they need help. But, and often in these situations where clergy lose their church or their credentials, it's an overnight kind of thing that might affect their housing, their friends, their kids' friends, their wife's friends, everyone might have their world turned upside down, and not even necessarily for a moral failure. Sure, there are those extreme situations that something has to be done right away, but more of the situations are actually, if they had reached out for help sooner, or even the thing that they're confessing is not really a moral failure, it's a struggle internally, or they're thinking about leaving ministry. So there's just all these factors that make it really hard.
There's this very rational way of looking at it, I guess, that in isolation, we're capable of doing a lot of things, and so what we always promote, at least in the church, is, in my church, that if you have people in your life, it's easier for you to make the right decision, a good decision, with people around you, doing life together. It's easier. And so culturally, though, that's, things are very individualistic. And even in Christianity, especially I find in evangelical circles, It is about, when we say personal relationship, we think of it's me and God. It does not involve anybody else. And so these things that are solidly in traditional designs of being in a church are made less and less of a priority until you're in a place where you're really living outside the design of what it means to be Christian, and then a moral failure comes along, and we think, man, that shouldn't have happened. But really, left up to our own natural state of being, that's what happens. That's how it goes. So we shouldn't be surprised. And I don't know if you're a fan of forensic files.
I am not familiar, so you'll have to inform me.
I watch and I prescribe to our counselors, all these shows that they have on about human behavior. I just love to binge watch.
Christian Counseling Associates is ready to serve you, providing a wide range of counseling services. Christian counseling is accessible to everyone. We serve both Christians who want their faith integrated into the counseling process, or those holding any beliefs or attitudes toward spirituality. With many years of counseling experience, our counselors are professional, licensed, highly trained, and rooted in their commitment to their church and communities. CCA is able to provide a full range of clinical counseling services. For more information, visit our website at www.ccawpa.com.
The things that happen in the mind and the heart, if you really pay attention to what's in your mind and the heart, there's a lot going on there. There just is, and so that's part of the design of the church, is we deal with that. And so this thing that you're seeing, with clergy being isolated, there's no chance for that to happen. Yeah, we've seen a lot of clergy get in trouble.
And, I think sometimes pastors, there's kind of, I don't know, some conversations around that, all these pastors are narcissistic and it's this widespread, thing. Really, the research indicates that about 95% of pastors are psychologically normal. They're not, they might struggle with depression or anxiety, but they're not pathological. But you have these high profile cases where lots of people get hurt by a pastor who does have narcissistic personality disorder. Certainly also you think of people who are, sexually abusing congregants or, other types of emotional and physical abuse, right? These, they're high profile, so it feels like it's everywhere and everybody has a story. But unfortunately, that kind of makes us miss the typical everyday pastor, especially the solo pastor who doesn't get paid very much, lives in a rural town, is just trying to do what God called him to do. And unfortunately, that's the person who's suffering and really doesn't have anywhere to turn. That's not going to turn into him murdering his neighbor or, necessarily assaulting someone or, abusing someone. But it is going to mean that, that person's probably going to burn out, might kind of hit a wall at age 50 and not really have another career option to go to, or these pastors that are so financially struggling that they can't retire. That's one of the hugest problems in the church right now, the aging clergy. Young people aren't coming in to become clergy, but also clergy who probably need to retire can't because they don't have enough savings for retirement. So there's just all these pressures that go into kind of what your typical everyday pastor is dealing with, which is different than kind of, the mega churches make the headlines. And yes, there's a growing number of those, but that's not the story of kind of the average pastor.
Yeah, so when we talk about clergy too, we want to remind the public and just say in general, we love pastors. We admire them greatly. We love the job that they're doing. We're just trying to be real about some real things that happen. And so I would say to everybody out there that pastors are always welcome at CCA. We have pastors and other leaders from the community who come here frequently, just like everybody else does. And you don't have to have insurance to come here. We have a way to have an affordable, sustainable way to come here. We fund that through our foundation. and we would be glad to talk and connect with anybody, especially pastors, knowing the pressures that they're under. But they can get burned out, and and so you talk about this. You have narcissistic, and that's a big word, but you can become very self-centered and very self-assured and become blinded in that. And I think it's similar to professors. I remember a professor that I loved, and I won't mention any names here, but he would just wear the worst of clothing. It was just absurd. And he'd stand in front of the class, and people would actually go by him and say, "You're dressed so wonderfully today." And he would smile, and you'd have these interactions that were very unhealthy and very not real. But the kind of power that was being displayed there, and this dynamic of I used to lecture for an hour and 45 minutes, and you'd have people who would listen for that whole time. It's not natural, but people could spend that year after year and start to believe like that's because of who they are, and not the role that they play. So that is that can become very distorting, and people can get into like a very unreal thing in their mind.
Sure. Well, I think this is where some of the church trends are dangerous. They're dangerous for the church, they're dangerous for pastors and for congregants, because ultimately there is a lot of focus in certain, especially larger churches, on image, on performance, on seeming like you have it all together. So there is a lot of pretending that's going on, and you see that. I mean, some of the documentaries that have come out, I saw one on Hillsong, not to pick on them, but in the public, some of the lawsuits and criminal cases that are going on over there. There's many other of the big name churches as well. And it's kind of, why would this all be? Well, it makes sense if you set up, kind of a performance-based kind of celebrity pastor type of approach, that it's going to inherently kind of corrupt spiritually what God is trying to do, because it becomes about the wrong thing. We're worshiping the wrong thing. And I think that's a challenge to the American church as a whole. What is the direction of our worship? What kind of position are we putting pastors in? And then if there is this kind of celebrity pastor mindset, then who are we attracting into the ministry? People who want a platform and a microphone, rather than people who have maybe a servant's heart. But I have seen pastors leave the ministry in the recent years because they don't fit the celebrity pastor mold. And so they really can't actually, the congregational expectations of them can't be met. And they want to go visit people in the hospital and kind of do the traditional pastor, like caretaking, shepherding kind of role. And people don't want that. They want them to be, writing books, and, the church to be, selling albums and things like that. And so it's difficult.
Yeah, like the mega church. We had a church over here in Ohio. We're based in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh. But our offices are in 5 states. We just opened up in Arkansas, and so we're all over the place. And a neighboring state, of course, is Ohio. There was a pastor over there, a group of pastors that during Super Bowl Sunday, they were like punting the Bible into the stands. I don't know, Camden, did you see that one?
Yeah, I did.
It was like a scandal around here. It was publicized. So you see these celebrity kind of ridiculous demonstrations, or at least that's what this was framed about, generally. I think it's very interesting to the public to hear some scenarios or vignettes of things that have happened. I wonder if you have any, for us. I mean, things that you've studied of that would just be case studies and disasters that have happened.
I mean, that hasn't been part of my research, but I really have found valuable some of the work of Christianity Today, and particularly their Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. Certainly I could talk about Mark Driscoll and kind of kind of my observations of psychological profile, but he's not, a client or anyone I know, so I'm not going to, diagnose that. But I will say that podcast, man, every pastor should listen to that with just sober judgment and a heart to listen and hear, because I think even though it's easy to highlight Mark Driscoll and say, oh man, this happened, that happened, and it's isolated, that podcast captures some of these dangerous trends in the church that are really far beyond. I mean, Driscoll was kind of a ringleader and a kind of pioneer of some of those, but they have reached across, other than maybe small rural churches, it has reached suburbia and urban churches in ways that I think pastors need to do some self-examination and say, have I fallen into some of those same patterns? Maybe not to the extreme, but in ways that, I'm walking a line here of unhealth. And I would also mention Pete Scazzaro here with Emotionally Healthy Leadership as another option.
He's very popular in clergy circles, rightfully so. But just for the folks, let's summarize what Mars Hill was. Like, what happened at Mars Hill?
Yeah, well, again, I'm not going to paint myself as an expert. I've listened to the podcast through twice, so I feel like I can say a little bit about that. Essentially, think mega church, right? And Mark Driscoll is this guy who is really driving, early. Before a lot of internet trends were popular, before all the churches were streaming their services, they were putting their content out there online. They were emphasizing kind of clickbait types of things. So the more dramatic or extreme, would get highlighted. Also, he has very conservative views on gender roles. And so that played out in really unhealthy ways in the way that he talked about kind of manliness and also the place of women. Again, there's denominational differences, but the more you say that's extreme, the more clicks you get and the more listens you get. And so ultimately, very early on, he was kind of essentially influencing or pastoring across the country people that he did not know that were taking his kind of statements totally out of context. But then there was this community of people that were being, heavily influenced by him as well, and at times manipulated by him. One of the most extreme examples to me was they had this kind of community online forum, a discussion forum in the church. And Mark created kind of this alter persona that he was like commenting. I forget, it was like William something. I forget the name. It had a reference to it of why he chose that name, but he was commenting within the discussion forums, and people didn't realize that it was him at first, and saying like wild things and ridiculous things. So that's just some of it. It's a really complex scenario, but ultimately, he alienated a lot of people, said a lot of things, and ultimately now is pastoring again. And so, he has a following.
He was just very abusive. I remember there was some story. I wasn't able to. There's a whole tome of information about that, but there were people who were making accusations, and they would be assaulted. At least that's what it seemed like to me. I might be overplaying.
I'm not sure. Because there's no criminal cases, I don't know that there was any kind of physical or sexual abuse claims, but there was some healing ministry stuff that was kind of sideways. Very controlling, I think, is really where it comes down to.
Okay, it's just very controlling.
Spiritually abusive. And those are some of the things that I think make their way into the church in other scenarios as well.
Okay. Yeah, so that could be just an overplay of the authority and the position that you have, the power that you have inherent in the role that you play as a pastor who's reached celebrity status. Mars Hill is a good example of a clergy in crisis. I think of another example, Rob Bell. He's been examined a lot, and there's a lot of people like him. Rob Bell was it Numa that he had produced this series that was popular in youth ministry, and he was writing books, and then all of a sudden he just completely departs from traditional Christianity.
Yeah, his Love Wins was really kind of departure from traditional views of heaven and hell and things like that.
Right, and then Francis Chan writes a rebuttal to that, and he's basically ousted from the church. I forget what church he was going to, but that must have been devastating to people who followed him and felt that he was a biblical teacher.
Yeah. I mean, think about the fact that we're having this conversation right now, that we're able to rattle off these pastors' names. Like, this is such an interesting phenomenon. I think maybe Rick Warren was one of the earlier kind of America's pastor. Billy Graham maybe is a one example, but if you rewind to Billy Graham era, like, it was the evangelists that people knew of, but it wasn't kind of connected to a specific church or things like that. So this idea that you have this church, this following, this platform, you're going to sell your books, you're going to make money. I think Rick has made some decisions to try to be careful about that. He talked about the reverse tithe, which I think now is even less than 10%. He lives on 10% and gives the church 90%. He's paid back the church every salary that they ever gave him because of the purpose-driven life in his book. So, there's pastors that are trying to do it right. Craig Rochelle is another example of somebody that, man, I hope he stays on the path that he's on. And but you see people like Bill Hybels or even John Ortberg that have kind of fallen, for various reasons. So the fact that we're having this conversation, naming all these names, and that we, have seen many of these scenarios go really wrong, I think that's the thing, that now we have a situation where a really unhealthy place for pastors to be is the pressure that they that's the exact pressure that they're getting, is be this celebrity. We want you to be this name recognized person, but it's really tearing the church and pastors apart. And so I think that's, the challenge. It's the challenge.
It's high pressure. I've seen, there is, the American Gospel. If you've seen that series, now it's in its third iteration, but they sometimes will get people on camera, clergy who become atheists, and it's a very stark kind of interview. And you have all these things that are happening. I don't know what happened to John Ortberg, but I remember he was part of the American Association of Christian Counselors. He would come in there and lecture, a lot. There was Rick Warren's wife, I think, would come.
She's heavily involved in mental health advocacy because of their son who died by suicide, and he had bipolar disorder, Matthew.
The son died by suicide. I've seen her talk about that. And Rick Warren, I don't want to misquote what's going on with him in the Southern Baptist Church now, but I think his Saddleback is out. And
yes, they got kicked out last year because of having women in pastoral roles. And there's been some controversy about his choice. I forget that. I want to say Andy Wood, maybe, but that could be wrong, of who kind of was his successor. There was some backlash about that related to this celebrity pastor idea. I don't really know the story directly, but there's certainly been news commentary and social media commentary about that choice. So, I mean, I don't think you can be a celebrity and be immune to all these things, right?
And there's this very complicated thing that if you're outside of the core membership of the church, I could only imagine how this sounds. To start to describe the situation around Rick Warren and whether there's concern at all, because I think he's been cast as a hero, a lot of circles. But still, one of the largest churches in the country has said, you're out. And, it's hard to know what to think. Yeah, but we just went through a whole crisis with the United Methodist Church. Huge, worldwide. The leaders of the church said, we disagree with the Bible. And, people will disagree with my characterization of that, but they completely, reworked foundational teachings of Christianity right before everybody's eyes, and they expect that it'll be passed off. That, that kind of stuff makes you a cult. Technically, But that is, we see that happen, clergy perpetrating that. And, there was a reaction. Now you have two churches, and the general public doesn't really know what happened there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, people outside of the church in America looking at all of this, I mean, sometimes I feel this way too. All I can see is a toxic system sometimes. And I'm like, well, this can't be what God designed for his bride. Like, this can't be right. And so I think there's a lot of people who are stepping back and saying, okay, this system has become toxic, not entirely, but it's almost, like there's a cancer in our church. And so what do we do?
Why get involved? Why get involved in this? Is there's a lot of, I guess the Zoomer generation, the 20 somethings are saying, I'm not doing it.
Yeah. Well, and some of them, I mean, you see this with like the ex-evangelical movement. They are saying, I absolutely believe what I was taught when I was growing up, and the church has left that. And so to be true to that, I actually need to go over here to some of the Methodist or Episcopal, Anglican. Lots of people are becoming Anglican right now. Like, it's kind of the trend to go back to liturgy, to go back to something that feels sacred, to something that feels stable, because people want to keep believing in God. They want to believe that Jesus was a healthy leader, not a toxic leader. And that's, I think people are just craving that. And where else do they go but to try to find it? Now, those denominations are not without their own past history and challenges. So that's not necessarily the answer, but it is what some people have found for them to continue in their faith as they see certain pockets of evangelicalism move into directions that honestly, don't feel like they're aligning with the gospel anymore.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of confusion and a gravitation towards something that feels safe, non-toxic. And I imagine the clergy who are in crisis, get into all of this and say, this is not what I thought I was getting into.
Right. Or this is exactly what I thought I was getting into, but I didn't realize the internal and external ramifications of what that was going to be. Maybe they were attracted to the celebrity pastor idea, but then getting in there, Carl Lentz was in the Hillsong documentary, and he's a challenging figure. Just, again, I don't know him personally, but he had a real trauma story ultimately that he shared in that Hillsong documentary. And he stepped back and sought counseling and healing for that, and realized a lot of things about why he was drawn into that in the first place, why that adoration from the crowd and even from the lead pastor there, why that was so appealing to him, as a trauma survivor. So he had some insightful things to say. I think he and his wife are just launched some other new venture now, and I don't know what it is, but I know some people were expressing maybe concern about that he was going to kind of step back into the limelight in some kind of way. I don't really know, but I look at stories like that, even Mark Driscoll, and the counselor in me just wants to sit down with them and listen, because I know that underneath all of the bravado and all of that is like brokenness. Whether or not they can access that, Carl had some display of that in the documentary. I don't know that I've seen anything of public, at least of Mark, but you just know that there's deep hurt. Pastors, what's not talked about enough is trauma in ministry. We know that pastors are sometimes perpetrators of trauma, and that is like something the church needs to address and deal with and stop kind of sweeping under the rug. But also there are a lot of pastors who are themselves experiencing trauma from being in ministry, deep hurt, deep wounds, relationships broken, all kinds of scenarios that the rest of the congregation probably has no idea about, but you're carrying this pain and hurt. And that's a real story for quite a lot of ministers.
Well, I think when you're a leader and you're responsible over hundreds of people, it is just a complicated deal. Our organization, we oversee about 100 employees, and getting the contact with people, it's intense sometimes. I'd like to say it's just like a family when you're being successful at it. And anybody who has been the head of a family, it brings everything out of your heart, that good and bad. And sometimes it's shocking, and it's just the way that it is. And so, I wonder sometimes what's the more difficult job, the people who are leading or the people who are following. I think they both have intense roles, but
Yeah.
Definitely people can get twisted up in that. And families, you should be intentional about making that a place where it's safe to be.
Right.
And even when we're in the right and like you're saying, toxic, what does that mean? You're going after somebody and you damage them beyond recovery. That happens in families and in churches, and I think it probably happens too frequently in the Christian community.
Yeah. I mean, if we think about, I'm just sitting here reflecting on the fruit of the Spirit, not as a to-do list, not as a list of feelings, but as a genuine, like, this is what the orchard produces, right? Like an apple orchard produces apples, the fruit of the Spirit, right? We produce love, joy, peace, patience, etc. All of these things. Like, if that were characteristic of the church, right? Of congregations, of systems, of pastors, like how different might the church look in America, as opposed to, I need to be right, or I need to take a stand, or I need to get clicks or likes or followers, whatever, that everything that we're pursuing is very American and but we've called a lot of that biblical. And I think there's really, a challenge there to sort through what is it that we've claimed as biblical that is actually just seeking after fame, money, and power, and what is it that we, can go back to demonstrate love and experience joy. And again, not as a pressure or to-do list, like you ought to be doing this, but just that's the fruit that's growing out of the things you're cultivating in your heart. I think that's a word for all of us, pastors and congregants. Like, we all need to just be that to each other. And I really think that would produce a lot more of the health, again, that Pete Scazzaro, I think he points to some of the internal kind of emotional intelligence, and also just healthy cultivation of the self.
Yeah, well, and just like we said for the clergy, we'd like to say for the church, we love the church. It is the best place to be. And, to answer the question, I have a great group of friends in the church. They're like family to me. They're priority in my lives. And, I've had to put a lot of work into that. And it hasn't been a perfect process. Sometimes you get a little hurt, and hopefully you're careful and don't get banged up too much, just like in any family. But it's worth building. It's worth certainly making that the center of your life. You just have to watch out. There's a lot of stuff going on there. So again, getting back to this topic, what are some, just from your research and the work that you've done, some points that we would want to hit on? Okay, what do we do with all these crises, these problems? And maybe there's something that you would just like to get in there. Like, here's another part of clergy crisis that the public needs to.
Yeah, I'm not sitting here like, with a factoid to share, but I think the takeaway from all of this is really to come back to, what does it mean for the church to be a safe place? I think it was Larry Crabb that wrote a book 30 years ago, The Safest Place on Earth, and describing kind of what the church could look like. I think there's some room for us to sit with each other in less judgment and more acceptance, even of struggles, even when a person's wrong. What do we do to create that safe space? I talk to my students about, counseling, and part of this integration of our faith and our mission as Christians, and then, the psychological work of counseling, there's something so sacred about a place that is genuinely safe for a person to say the deepest parts of, what's on their heart, what they're going through, what they've experienced, and for that to be a non-judgmental place. Again, not that we want, as a counselor, I'm not like, okay, good, now we've established that you're broken and you're going to stay that way, right? Like, hopefully the process is a healing one, but we're so afraid of like being wrong or letting someone, you know, not get called out on something, that we kind of jump to judgment. And I think that we're almost like afraid of not speaking into a situation when really, we can listen a whole lot more than we do. And I think that's true of if we're sitting with pastors, we can listen to them, but pastors can also sit and listen to congregants, and we can bring more counselors into church spaces as well, to provide that safe place.
Absolutely. Listening and making connections with people. And you mentioned, if Rob Driscoll came to me, I would like to sit with him and listen to him and find out what's really going on and really connect over that with a sense of optimism. Maybe we could work this out. And that's
or not even work it out. Just because he's a human being, give him a safe place and listen to him. That there doesn't have to be a thing we're doing at the end of the day, because there's something in of itself that's important about just letting another person be themselves, and that we don't have to live in fear of that, I guess. And sometimes Christians, we do fear that if we don't correct someone right away, they're going to be led astray, when really often people arrive at the right conclusion by having a safe space to work it out.
Right. And, we talk about these counseling micro skills because, we have interns come in and even the most seasoned counselors, they've lost their ability to listen and just really be in the same space with somebody and have this kind of empathy that is a real connection that has to happen for hearts to open. So what you're saying is wise. I think people will just jump right to, let me tell you what you need to do. And if that's what they needed, you wouldn't need counseling. But I also remind counselors here that counseling, there is the good enough counselor, and those are the people in the church who inherently know how to do this and become better at this. And there is, the symbolic nature of the counseling hour. It has a beginning and an end, which means at some point time's up. And it means that we don't have forever to get this thing done. And there's this basic thing where, coming in contact with each other and being accountable means that I've come to a place where I'm stuck. I need to acknowledge that. And then I really need help. I can't do it on my own. And I think sometimes, in these toxic environments and things that have happened in the past and what the world says we should do, we wish people were not involved in us getting unstuck. But I would repeat something I like that Henry Cloud says in How People Grow, that people are God's plan A. He doesn't need us. He chooses to do it that way. Yeah. And so it's just a reality we need to deal with. And that's where the mind does best. If we're in crisis, where are we going to heal? It's when we're standing on something real, not fantasy. So all of that kind of thing, eventually when we have this meeting of connecting empathically, and man, that takes more time than we would like. And we often want to short circuit it and rush ahead. Eventually we're going to have to talk about where we're stuck, get real about it. And that's the essence of the the next phase of the counseling process past these micro skills. And we'd want the clergy to know that they could come and do that. And at the end of it, you're not going to be judged or kicked out of the ministry or anything like that. You'll sharpen your ability to do that too. And you'll have a lot of work going back into the church, because a lot of people really everybody needs to open up in that way. So that's my take on what it means to be a counselor. And a wise lady once said to me that these professional counselors, these professional Christian counselors, are the first counselor. But then there's the church, and they're the multitude of counselors, and they outdo that first counselor. They're the people, the church, who sit around you. Takes time. So we wish people would engage this. Of course, being a counselor, I have a bias. I want you to come to counseling, and this topic of clergy in crisis. We deeply care about people who are isolated and they're in trouble. And even if it was Rob Driscoll, or I mean, why do I say Rob Driscoll? It's Rob Bell or Mark Driscoll, or maybe some of us are out there, reflecting on the things that we've done, and really see that we're in a worse spot. And could use some help. So I'm really glad that you have written a book on mental illness in the Christian context. I think we need to learn about that. And I think that this is something that we all need to consider. How's our pastor doing?
Yeah, and also just a note that with that book, the leader's guide that I mentioned is an 8-week curriculum. So any church, if you have a Sunday school time or a small group time, you could do an 8-week study that would just help you get more information about, mental health, mental illness, some of these tough questions that Christians are asking. So it's meant to be a resource that you go through together as a group. And you don't have to be someone struggling with your mental health to do that. It's not meant to be kind of treatment or prescriptive. It's just totally informational to help congregations, start with, okay, let's sit with the stigma that maybe exists within our community, and how do we break that down? And the other thing, just jumping back to, you talked about the time it takes counseling, and even your own support network and things, right? Like, some of what we have to do is acknowledge that we're rushing through life looking for quick fixes when we really need to kind of take time out, do less, and invest in people more, invest in our internal well-being more. And that does mean there's hard choices to be made. That's not an easy thing, or that's something that's going to happen immediately. Usually people, when they hit a crisis, whether that's pastors or anyone, they look around and go, who are the people in my life? And if you haven't cultivated those relationships, it's a little bit too late, because that's, when you need people. So if everything's going great in your life and you feel like your mental health is going well, then, grab a friend or two, figure out ways to invest in people. And I'll tell you what, I've had this experience myself. We wish the phone would ring, right? We want someone else to reach out to us. And that's how we think friendships are going to form. And honestly, it means I need to reach out to people. And if that's, it feels like, well, if they really liked me, that they would reach back out. No, you just have to go get that for yourself. It's just kind of how it works. And sometimes we get too discouraged too quickly on how hard it is to build community for ourselves.
Yeah, and like you're saying, when the crisis happens, it's too late. We had an episode where Tim Murphy, he did a book on trauma. Former congressman talked about resilience, and resilience is the things that you do before the crisis. And so these are wise moves, and we could be sitting here saying, I don't need any of this. I'm fine. Until the flood strikes and you have nothing, and so these kind of connections and things that you build up in your life, and maybe it's, you can't slow down, and when you said like slow down and invest in people, maybe you have to do both now. Yeah. Get it done however you can, but make a decision to make it a priority. That is going to make big differences. And so, Kristen Kansevich, You've written this book, On Edge, Mental Illness in the Christian Context. There's a leader's guide. You can explore these dynamics over 8 weeks and really kind of set these priorities in your life and gain some resiliency because we're going to face challenges.
Yeah, that particular week, I mean, that small group curriculum is focused more informationally. So in terms of resilience or kind of doing your own work, there's a couple of other books that I have on Amazon. So I don't know if you link that in show notes or anything, but I have a book called Getting Your Life Under Control and one called Momentum, also Emotional Traps. So those are the ones that are meant to kind of help people do some of that internal work. And the On Edge book is purely informational about mental illness.
Well, that's great, Kristen. And yeah, we should check Kristen out online and see those other books too. But Kristen, I want to thank you for being here today. It's just really been great to get a chance to talk with you. And if I could ask you, would you end us in prayer and pray for the clergy who may be listening to us?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. God, we just come to you and we thank you for this time, for this conversation. And I do pray right now for those who are listening, God, if there is a need that is there, someone who has resonated with the things we've talked about, people who are feeling isolated or lonely, maybe that pastor out there that's been not sure about whether or not they should stay in ministry or reach out to a counselor or things like that. God, I just pray that you would speak into that need right now in this moment, that your spirit would kind of encounter each listener and that you would do the work to heal and restore and build your church. God, make us vehicles and instruments in that process. Help us to just be contributing to a beautiful orchard that is producing the fruit of the Spirit, God, that we would be part of that process. And just pray that you would just reach and touch those listeners right now who are looking for help. Pray that you would connect them with the right resources and just give them what they need. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you for being with us, Kristen. And folks, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.